The heavy oak doors of the cathedral did not just open, they were violently blown off their ancient iron hinges. A deafening crash echoed through the high-vaulted ceilings, shattering the sacred silence of my wedding day. I stood frozen on the marble altar, dressed in a breathtaking gown of spun white silk and imported pearls. At 22 years old, I was the pride of my wealthy family and the envy of every woman in high society. My heart hammered against my ribs like a terrified bird trapped inside a golden cage. This beautiful summer morning was supposed to be the moment I secured a peaceful, predictable future. I was moments away from marrying Matthew, a respectable man from a wealthy merchant family. Matthew was handsome, mild-mannered, and offered a life completely free of danger or wild unpredictability. I had chosen this safe harbor because I was profoundly terrified of the stormy ocean. Exactly 1 year ago, I stood shivering in a moonlit rose garden and rejected the most feared man in our realm. Dominic was an alpha, a towering force of raw, unapologetic masculinity whose mere presence commanded absolute submission. His broad shoulders, midnight dark hair, and piercing golden eyes haunted my dreams every single night. When Dominic had asked me to be his mate, his voice was a low, possessive rumble that ignited a fire in my blood. But I told him his world of territorial wars and primal instincts was entirely too brutal for a girl like me. I turned my back on the alpha who would have laid the world at my feet, all because I was afraid of his intensity. Now, as armed mercenaries flooded the holy sanctuary with drawn swords, I realized how foolish my illusion of safety truly was. The delicate fragrance of white roses was instantly suffocated by the sharp, metallic stench of fresh blood and unwashed leather. Men in dark armor ruthlessly shoved my screaming wedding guests to the cold stone floor. Their leader, a massive brute with a jagged scar across his face named Silas, locked his cruel eyes directly on me. Silas marched down the long center aisle with the terrifying confidence of a wolf cornering a helpless lamb. My hands trembled violently as I reached out to grasp my fiancé's arm for comfort and much-needed protection. I desperately expected the man I was about to marry to step forward and shield my body with his own. Instead, I felt Matthew's arm physically flinch and pull away from my desperate, pleading fingers. I turned my head and watched in absolute disbelief as my future husband scrambled backward in sheer terror. Matthew hid himself behind the heavy velvet curtains of the choir stand, abandoning me without a single second glance. The safe, sensible man I had chosen over a powerful alpha was openly cowering in the shadows to save his own life. A hot tear of bitter realization and profound humiliation rolled down my pale cheek. Silas finally reached the altar, stepping over dropped prayer books and crushed wedding flowers without hesitation. The mercenary grabbed my bare shoulder with a callous grip that felt exactly like crushing iron. He yanked me forward so violently that the intricate pearl embroidery on my bodice tore with a sickening rip. A cold, heavy steel blade was abruptly pressed tight against the frantic pulse in my throat. The entire cathedral plunged into a suffocating, terrified silence under the lethal threat of his weapon. Silas announced to the weeping crowd that my father would pay an astronomical ransom, or the beautiful bride would bleed out on the marble. The sharp edge of the blade bit slightly into my delicate skin, sending a warm trickle of blood down my collarbone. I closed my eyes tightly, realizing with crushing despair that no one in this room possessed the courage or strength to save me. But in that exact moment of absolute hopelessness, a strange, burning sensation rushed through my icy veins. It was a phantom heat, an electric awareness that I had deliberately suppressed since that night in the rose garden. Hundreds of miles away, in a fortress carved into the freezing northern mountains, an ancient instinct violently awakened. Alpha Dominic was sitting at the head of a massive stone war table, surrounded by his fiercest generals. Without warning, a visceral shockwave of pure agony and terror hit his broad chest. Dominic slammed his heavy fists down, cracking the solid granite table straight down the middle. His golden eyes, usually as cold and calculating as winter ice, ignited with the terrifying fury of a predator sensing its mate in peril. He could vividly feel my sheer terror, my profound betrayal, and my physical pain echoing across the vast distance between our souls. The spiritual bond one had so foolishly rejected was still actively tying my fragile heartbeat to his indestructible spirit. Dominic rose to his full, intimidating height, radiating an aura of murderous rage that forced his battle-hardened men to drop to their knees. He did not care that I had publicly broken his heart 12 months ago. He did not care that I was currently wearing another weak man's expensive diamonds. Some foolish mortal had dared to draw the blood of his chosen female. The Alpha's deep, earth-shattering roar commanded his fastest horses and his most bloodthirsty riders to prepare for immediate slaughter. I shivered helplessly against the cold steel knife in the ruined cathedral, praying for a miracle. I was completely unaware that the dangerous man I threw away was already riding south to burn the world to ashes for me. The brutal gallop of Silas's massive warhorse slammed my fragile body repeatedly against the unforgiving leather saddle. Every single bone in my body ached as we plunged deeper into the treacherous, uncharted territories of the Shadow Ridge forest. The breathtaking white silk of my custom wedding dress was now torn into dirty, blood-stained rags. Cold night air bit fiercely into my exposed skin, making me shiver violently under the kidnapper's cruel, bruising grip. Silas held me sideways across the horse, his heavily armored arm pressing down on my lungs like a physical weight of absolute despair. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted hot copper, absolutely refusing to give these vile monsters the satisfaction of hearing me cry. Back in the safety of the warm cathedral city, my coward of a fiancé was already weaving a pathetic web of deceit. Matthew stood before my weeping, heartbroken father, his pristine wedding suit completely free of dust or blood. The cowardly merchant claimed that 50 heavily armed assassins had ambushed him, and that he had fought valiantly until he was knocked unconscious. He lied flawlessly through his teeth to protect his fragile ego, successfully convincing the city guards that pursuing the kidnappers at night was pure suicide. My wealthy father, desperate and entirely deceived by the man he trusted, immediately began liquidating his vast estates to gather the impossible ransom Silas demanded. Nobody in the civilized southern territories dared to ride into the deadly wilderness to rescue a stolen, ruined bride. They all believed that waiting for formal negotiations was the only sensible way to handle such brutal barbarism. But my true rescue was not coming from the polite, civilized world of merchants and high society. Rescue was currently tearing down the Northern King's Highway at a suicidal, breakneck speed. Dominic did not bother with diplomatic negotiations, ransom letters, or the slow gathering of a formal army. The terrifying Alpha rode at the absolute front of a 50-man vanguard, his massive black stallion foaming madly at the mouth. His elite warriors, the most feared and ruthless killers in the icy north, struggled desperately to keep up with their furious leader. Dominic's golden eyes burned like twin suns in the pitch-black night, his primal vision piercing straight through the heavy darkness. The ancient beast roaring inside his broad chest was completely clawing at the fragile cages of his human restraint. He could still vividly taste my lingering terror in the back of his throat, an agonizing reminder of my ultimate vulnerability. Every mile he crossed felt like a punishing eternity, fueling a murderous rage that made the cold air around him crackle with raw, dominant energy. He remembered the soft, intoxicating scent of sweet vanilla and delicate jasmine that always clung to my warm skin. It was the exact, paralyzing scent that had driven him to his knees a year ago, begging a mere human girl to be his eternal mate. Now, that beautiful memory was violently tainted by the foul, metallic stench of fear and another man's filthy hands. The absolute disrespect of it made Dominic's sharp fangs involuntarily lengthen, grazing his lower lip until a heavy drop of dark blood appeared. Back in the dense, terrifying forest, Silas finally ordered his exhausted mercenaries to make camp near a rushing, ice-cold river. He roughly dragged me down from the towering horse and threw me effortlessly onto the damp, muddy ground like a piece of garbage. My scraped hands instinctively flew out to break my painful fall, the sharp rocks tearing fresh, bleeding cuts into my delicate palms. "Don't try anything stupid, little princess," Silas sneered, his deeply scarred face twisting into a hideous, mocking grin. Your pathetic merchant boy isn't coming to save you, and your daddy's gold won't arrive for at least a week. He roughly tied my aching wrists together with thick, abrasive rope, binding me securely to the thick trunk of a decaying oak tree. I leaned my tired, dizzy head against the rough bark, closing my eyes as the bitter reality of my absolute isolation washed over me. I had foolishly traded the fierce, unyielding protection of a dominant alpha for the false, hollow security of a weak man. As the mercenaries passed around bottles of cheap liquor and laughed cruelly at my ruined wedding gown, a strange calmness suddenly settled over my panicked heart. The phantom heat I had felt back in the ruined cathedral was returning, humming warmly beneath my freezing, bruised skin. It felt exactly like a heavy, protective velvet cloak being gently draped over my shivering, exhausted shoulders. I did not know how, and I certainly did not know why, but my broken soul instantly recognized the approaching storm. I slowly opened my eyes, looking past the roaring campfire and staring deeply into the impenetrable darkness of the northern woods. The wind shifted abruptly, carrying the faint, distant scent of the southern forests directly toward the advancing northern riders. Hundreds of miles away, Dominic abruptly yanked back on his leather reins, bringing his massive warhorse to a violent, sliding halt. His elite vanguard immediately stopped behind him, the sudden silence of the night thick with extremely dangerous anticipation. The alpha fled his nostrils, inhaling deeply as his heightened, supernatural senses analyzed every single particle in the rushing wind. Beneath the heavy scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth, he finally caught the invisible trail. It was a microscopic trace of vanilla and jasmine, laced heavily with the undeniable, infuriating tang of freshly spilled blood. My blood. A low, terrifying growl erupted from the very bottom of Dominic's chest, vibrating through the solid ground and terrifying the surrounding wildlife. They are heading toward the Shadow Ridge, Dominic commanded, his voice a lethal, icy whisper that demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. We do not stop for water, we do not stop for rest, and we do not take a single prisoner alive tonight. The hardened men roared in unified, bloodthirsty agreement, drawing their heavy broadswords as they charged directly into the suffocating darkness. Back at the mercenary camp, the biting, relentless cold of the wilderness was slowly seeping into my very bones. Silas walked heavily over to where I was tied, his thick leather boots deliberately crushing the delicate wildflowers beneath them. He reached out and roughly grabbed a handful of my messy, tangled hair, forcing me to look up into his cruel, laughing eyes. You are remarkably quiet for a spoiled little rich girl, Silas taunted, his foul breath making my stomach turn with disgust. I stared back at him with a newfound, icy resolve, absolutely refusing to let him see the terrifying depths of my fear anymore. You made a fatal mistake today, Silas, I whispered softly, my voice shockingly steady despite my violently shivering frame. The scarred mercenary laughed heartily, clearly amused by the empty, desperate threats of a helpless, ruined bride. And who is exactly going to make me pay for it? Silas mocked, gesturing wildly to the dark, empty forest surrounding us. Your useless husband? I did not break eye contact as a single, silent tear finally escaped and rolled slowly down my dirt-smudged cheek. No, I replied smoothly, the beautiful image of golden eyes and midnight hair flashing vividly across my exhausted mind. The man I should have married. Silas's harsh laughter echoed through the desolate woods, a grating sound that sharply disrupted the absolute stillness of the night. He threw his head back, highly amused by the sheer audacity of my quiet, tearful defiance. There is no man in this entire realm who would ride into the Shadow Ridge after midnight, Silas declared with absolute, arrogant certainty. He turned his back on me completely, walking back toward the roaring campfire to join his drunken, celebrating men. I remained tied tightly against the rough bark of the oak tree, my bound wrists throbbing with a dull, persistent pain. But the strange, comforting warmth beneath my skin was growing exponentially stronger with every passing second. It was no longer just a faint phantom heat, it was a roaring inferno of protective energy wrapping completely around my shivering soul. Suddenly, the crickets and night birds that had been singing loudly in the dark canopy stopped their noise all at once. An unnatural, suffocating silence violently slammed down upon the mercenary camp like a physical, heavy lead blanket. The roaring campfire in the center of the clearing flickered wildly, the bright orange flames shrinking down to terrified blue embers. A sudden, unnatural frost began to rapidly spread across the damp moss and fallen leaves at the edge of the campsite. One of the younger mercenaries stopped drinking his cheap liquor, staring nervously into the impenetrable wall of towering pine trees. "Did you hear that?" the young man whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he drew a rusty dagger from his leather belt. Silas rolled his severely scarred eyes, clearly annoyed by the sudden, cowardly interruption of his victorious celebration. "It is just a wild boar, you pathetic coward," the mercenary leader snapped, taking a deep swig from his own glass bottle. But I knew deep in my desperate soul that it was absolutely not a wild boar hiding in those freezing dark woods. The massive, ancient trees themselves seemed to lean away from the tree line in absolute, primal submission to an unseen force. A low, rumbling vibration began to shake the solid earth beneath our feet, rattling the discarded iron weapons on the damp ground. It was not the chaotic, clanking sound of a marching army, it was the synchronized, lethal stealth of supreme apex predators. Out of the absolute pitch-black darkness, a pair of glowing, golden eyes materialized, burning with a lethal intensity that froze my veins. Those terrifying eyes were closely followed by a second pair, then a third, until dozens of glowing orbs completely surrounded the camp. The terrified horses tied near the river began to panic violently, snapping their thick leather tethers and fleeing blindly into the cold water. Silas finally dropped his liquor bottle, the heavy glass shattering loudly against a flat stone as he urgently reached for his broadsword. "To arms!" Silas roared in absolute panic, suddenly realizing that his men were completely surrounded by an invisible, deadly nightmare. But his desperate command came entirely too late to save his doomed, arrogant crew of kidnappers. A towering figure slowly stepped out from the dense shadows of the ancient forest, moving with the terrifying grace of a hunting wolf. Dominic stood at the absolute edge of the flickering firelight, his massive, broad-shouldered frame blocking out the moonlight completely. He was dressed in dark, impenetrable combat armor that absorbed the light, making him look like the physical embodiment of death itself. The Alpha did not immediately draw a weapon, nor did he issue a single, boastful threat to the trembling mercenaries. He simply released the full, unadulterated crushing weight of his dominant Alpha aura directly into the small, terrified clearing. Several of the weaker mercenaries instantly dropped to their knees, clutching their throats as they struggled desperately to breathe. The sheer, suffocating atmospheric pressure of his commanding presence forced the arrogant men to physically bow down before him. Silas gripped his heavy sword with both hands, his scarred face turning chalk-white with a terrifying, profound realization. He finally understood that he had not kidnapped the helpless daughter of a wealthy merchant, he had stolen the soulmate of the Northern King. Dominic slowly swept his glowing, golden gaze across the pathetic camp, his handsome expression a mask of beautiful, terrifying stone. Then, his burning eyes finally landed directly on me, bound tightly to the rough oak tree in my ruined, blood-stained wedding gown. The exact moment our eyes locked across the smoky clearing, the entire world around me completely ceased to exist. I saw the precise, terrifying moment his icy, disciplined control shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He saw the angry red scratches on my delicate face, the torn silk of my expensive dress, and the thick ropes biting cruelly into my bruised wrists. A devastating, thunderous growl ripped from the very depths of his broad chest, a sound so primal and terrifying that it made the ground physically crack. "Kill them all," Dominic commanded softly, his velvet voice cutting through the silent night like a razor-sharp steel blade. "But leave the leader strictly for me to handle." Before Silas could even raise his heavy sword in defense, the dark shadows themselves seemed to violently come alive. 50 elite northern warriors descended upon the clearing in a rapid blur of lethal, calculated, and absolute precision. I closed my eyes tightly, unable to watch the brutal, inevitable consequences of my own terrifying kidnapping unfold in front of me. I could only hear the heavy clashing of steel, the desperate cries for mercy, and the loud thuds of the kidnappers falling instantly to the dirt. The cowardly men who had mocked my tears mere minutes ago were entirely helpless against the Alpha's elite, merciless guard. In less than 60 seconds, the chaotic skirmish was completely over, leaving a haunting, incredibly heavy silence in its absolute wake. I kept my eyes firmly shut, my chest heaving with exhausted, terrified sobs as the overwhelming adrenaline finally began to leave my weak body. Then, I heard the heavy, deliberate, and slow crunch of Dominic's leather boots walking steadily toward my ancient tree. Every single step he took sent a powerful jolt of pure, undeniable electricity straight down my freezing, exhausted spine. The man I had ruthlessly rejected, the terrifying monster I had feared more than anything else in the world, was now standing directly in front of me. He did not speak a single word as he reached out toward me with surprisingly gentle, completely steady hands. The sharp, metallic sound of his blade slicing cleanly through my thick ropes was the absolute most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. The exact moment the abrasive, thick ropes were completely severed, my exhausted legs finally gave out beneath me. I braced my aching body for the harsh, muddy ground, fully expecting another painful, humiliating impact against the cold earth. Instead, I collapsed directly into a massive, heavily armored chest that radiated a glorious, overwhelming, and protective heat. Dominic caught my fragile, trembling body with terrifying speed, his incredibly strong arms wrapping around me like an impenetrable fortress of pure muscle. The most feared, ruthless warlord in the entire Northern Hemisphere was holding me as if I were made of the finest, most delicate glass. I weakly pressed my cold cheek against his solid metal breastplate, inhaling deeply as his intoxicating scent of pine and dark thunder washed completely over my senses. Every single, highly trained muscle in his massive frame was coiled tighter than a heavy steel spring, vibrating with an immense, unspent fury. Yet, the giant, calloused hands that gently supported my bruised back were shockingly tender, incredibly careful not to touch my fresh, bleeding wounds. He immediately unfastened his heavy, black fur-lined winter cloak, sweeping it securely around my shivering shoulders to completely hide my ruined, dirt-stained wedding dress. The thick, luxurious northern fur instantly blocked out the biting chill of the dark forest, enveloping my exhausted body in his powerful, dominant alpha scent. A pathetic, desperate, and high-pitched whimpering sound slowly dragged my exhausted attention back to the horrifying reality of the destroyed mercenary camp. Silas, the brutal, arrogant leader who had cruelly mocked my helpless tears only moments ago, was now crawling pathetically on his knees through the bloody mud. The heavily scarred mercenary had finally realized the catastrophic, world-ending magnitude of the unforgivable sin he had committed tonight. He was begging hysterically for his worthless, pathetic life, his previous mocking confidence completely shattered by the sheer gravity of the Alpha's overwhelming, suffocating aura. Dominic did not even bother to look down at the groveling, terrified man at his heavy leather boots, keeping his burning golden eyes entirely focused on my pale, tear-stained face. His lethal, calculating gaze meticulously catalogued every single scratch, every dark, painful bruise, and every single tear track on my dirt-smudged skin. With every new, painful injury he discovered on my body, a fresh wave of terrifying, murderous pressure rolled violently off his incredibly broad shoulders. "You dared to touch what is eternally mine," Dominic whispered, his remarkably low voice echoing with an ancient, terrifying authority that literally made the towering pine trees tremble. Silas sobbed uncontrollably like a broken child, pressing his sweaty forehead directly into the damp earth in a desperate, entirely cowardly display of complete submission. "I didn't know, my lord," Silas cried out, his rough voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror, and absolute regret. I swear on my life I didn't know she belonged to the Northern King. Dominic gently shifted his impressive weight, pulling me slightly closer to his incredibly warm, aggressively protective body. Ignorance is absolutely not a valid excuse for putting a steel blade to my chosen mate's throat, the Alpha replied with a deadly, icy calm that was far more terrifying than any loud scream. He slowly raised one massive, heavily gauntleted hand, silently signaling his elite, highly trained warriors to forcefully drag Silas entirely away from our immediate vicinity. Before I could even turn my dizzy head to witness the inevitable, brutal punishment, Dominic gently placed his large, incredibly warm hand completely over my eyes. "Do not look, my sweet girl," he murmured softly into my messy, tangled hair, his warm, mint-scented breath sending wild, electric shivers directly down my sensitive spine. "Your beautiful, innocent eyes have already witnessed far too much ugliness in this world today." I stood blindly in his immensely powerful embrace, completely surrounded by absolute visual darkness but feeling exponentially safer than I ever had in my entire, highly privileged life. The terrifying, sickening sounds of brutal, agonizing retribution echoed briefly through the freezing night air, a harsh, undeniable reminder of the ruthless monster he could truly be. But I did not pull away from his chest, nor did I tremble in fear of the violent, bloody justice being executed entirely on my behalf. The civilized man I had consciously chosen to marry, Matthew, had completely abandoned me to the wolves just to save his own pathetic, worthless skin. The dangerous man I had foolishly, stubbornly rejected, Dominic, had brutally slaughtered an entire camp of heavily armed mercenaries just to keep me safe from harm. The profound, emotionally devastating contrast between the two drastically different men finally shattered the last remaining wall of fear surrounding my stubborn, deeply foolish heart. When the agonizing, desperate screams finally faded into absolute, dead silence, Dominic slowly removed his warm, calloused hand from my tear-streaked face. The mercenary camp was completely cleared, his highly trained northern warriors having silently and efficiently removed every single trace of the brutal massacre. I looked cautiously up at his incredibly handsome, hard-angled face, fully expecting him to angrily demand his rightful, immediate reward for saving my ruined life. I braced my exhausted mind for an arrogant, highly possessive lecture about how utterly foolish I was to reject his powerful mating claim exactly 1 year ago. Instead, the terrifying, absolute ruler of the vast northern territories did something that completely stopped my frantic heart from beating. Dominic slowly lowered his massive, heavily armored frame, dropping gracefully down onto one solid knee directly in the bloody mud before me. He gently took my violently bruised, severely cut hand in both of his massive palms, holding my fragile, shaking fingers with shocking, absolute reverence. The dangerous, undefeated Alpha bowed his dark head deeply, gently pressing his soft, incredibly warm lips against my scraped knuckles in a breathtaking display of complete, unconditional devotion. "You are entirely safe now, Victoria," he promised softly, his deep, rumbling voice filled with an overwhelming, agonizing amount of pure love. "I will personally burn this entire, pathetic kingdom to ashes before I ever let another living soul harm you again." He remained kneeling in the cold dirt, completely ignoring the heavy, foul mud permanently staining his pristine, dark combat armor. I stared down at his incredibly broad, powerful shoulders, completely overwhelmed by the sheer, heartbreaking vulnerability he was showing me in front of his fiercest, most hardened warriors. His elite men stood in a perfectly silent, highly disciplined formation around the perimeter of the clearing, forming an impenetrable, deadly shield against the dark, unforgiving wilderness. Not a single soldier dared to look directly at us, their absolute, unwavering respect for their Alpha and his chosen mate evident in their rigid, deeply respectful posture. I slowly pulled my trembling, dirty hand from his gentle grip, a sudden, terrifying wave of absolute exhaustion finally crashing completely over my battered, broken body. My weak knees buckled once more, the massive, sudden adrenaline crash entirely draining the last remaining reserves of my failing physical strength. Before my falling body could even drop a single inch toward the ground, Dominic was instantly back on his feet, scooping me up effortlessly into his strong, fiercely protective arms. He cradled my body securely against his broad chest, carrying my dead weight as easily and gracefully as if I weighed absolutely nothing at all. "Sleep, my beautiful, brave girl," the Alpha commanded softly, his glowing golden eyes filled with an intense, fiery warmth that completely melted my deeply frozen heart. "When you finally wake up, this entire, horrible nightmare will be nothing more than a distant, easily forgotten memory." I rested my extremely heavy, aching head against his powerful, warm shoulder, finally allowing the deep, steady rhythmic beating of his strong heart to lull me into a peaceful, highly guarded darkness. For the very first time in my entire, complicated life, I was absolutely, undeniably certain that I was exactly where I was always meant to be. The heavy, suffocating darkness of my exhausted sleep slowly gave way to the comforting sensation of rich velvet pressing softly against my cheek. I cautiously fluttered my heavy eyelids open, immediately noticing the gentle, rhythmic swaying of a massive, undeniably luxurious horse-drawn carriage. The harsh, biting cold of the deadly Shadow Ridge forest had been completely replaced by the soothing, crackling warmth of a small iron stove tucked in the corner. My ruined, blood-stained wedding gown was entirely gone, replaced by a breathtakingly soft, snow-white fur tunic that smelled deeply of pine and dark thunder. Every single painful scratch and deep bruise on my delicate skin had been meticulously cleaned and carefully bandaged with the finest, purest white linen available. I slowly pushed myself up against the plush, silk-covered pillows, my wide, nervous eyes frantically searching the dimly lit, spacious cabin for my savior. Dominic was sitting completely still on the opposite velvet bench, his massive, heavily armored frame taking up an enormous amount of space in the elegant enclosure. The terrifying Northern King had completely removed his intimidating dark helmet, revealing his sharply angled, flawlessly handsome face illuminated by the soft golden firelight. His piercing, glowing golden eyes were already locked directly onto my pale face, filled with an intense, overwhelming mixture of fierce possessiveness and profound relief. He looked unusually exhausted, with dark shadows bruising the delicate skin beneath his beautiful eyes, proving he had not slept a single second while guarding my unconscious body. "You are finally awake, my beautiful girl," Dominic murmured softly, his deep, rumbling voice washing over my anxious soul like a warm, profoundly soothing wave. I stared at the absolute ruler of the North, my trembling heart breaking into a million tiny pieces as I fully realized the staggering magnitude of his unwavering devotion. This was the incredibly dangerous man I had foolishly called a savage monster, the powerful Alpha I had publicly humiliated in front of the entire noble court exactly 1 year ago. "I am so deeply sorry, Dominic," I whispered, my voice cracking violently as hot, bitter tears of profound regret suddenly flooded my stinging eyes. The massive, fearsome warlord visibly flinched at my unexpected tears, his stoic, hardened expression instantly shattering into a look of pure, agonizing panic. He moved across the spacious carriage with terrifying, predatory speed, dropping gracefully to his knees right beside my luxurious, velvet-covered bed. Dominic gently reached out with his massive, calloused hands, carefully wiping the falling tears from my pale cheeks with an extraordinarily tender, almost religious reverence. "Please do not cry, my sweet Victoria," he pleaded desperately, the absolute ruler of millions actually begging a broken, ruined bride to simply smile for him. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, not today, not tomorrow, and certainly not for the completely understandable choice you made last year." I shook my head stubbornly, leaning my wet cheek directly into his large, wonderfully warm palm, finally craving the dominant physical contact I had once feared so deeply. "I was utterly foolish and terribly blind," I sobbed quietly, my fragile fingers tentatively reaching out to trace the strong, sharp line of his hardened jaw. "I chose a weak, cowardly boy because I was terrified of your immense power," completely failing to see the profoundly beautiful, fiercely protective heart underneath your impenetrable armor. Dominic closed his striking golden eyes, leaning heavily into my gentle touch as a deep, rumbling purr of absolute contentment vibrated powerfully within his broad chest. I would gladly endure 1,000 agonizing rejections from your beautiful lips if it meant keeping you entirely safe from the profound evils of this dark world, he confessed fiercely. The undeniable, earth-shattering sincerity in his beautiful voice completely destroyed the very last remaining defensive walls around my stubbornly guarded heart. I slowly leaned forward and pressed my soft, trembling lips against the fading battle scar on his forehead, silently sealing my eternal, unbreakable vow to the only man who truly mattered. The dangerous, terrifying Northern King belonged entirely to me, and I was finally, completely ready to let the entire world burn to absolute ashes for our love. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in the supposedly safe, civilized southern capital, the pathetic illusion of my weak fiancé was already beginning to rapidly crumble. Matthew was standing nervously in the center of my wealthy father's grand, marble-floored study, heavy sweat violently beading on his pale, deceitful forehead. My heartbroken, desperate father had spent the entire, agonizing night liquidating his vast, highly profitable trading fleet to quickly gather Silas's outrageous gold ransom. He still firmly believed Matthew's cowardly lie about a massive ambush, trusting the young merchant who had selfishly abandoned his daughter to the merciless wolves. However, the captain of the Southern City Guard suddenly burst through the heavy mahogany doors, his face completely pale and his breathing incredibly erratic. "My lord, we have just received a terrifying, urgent message from the northern border outposts," the heavily armored guard announced with absolute, undeniable dread filling his voice. "The Northern King's massive, undefeated army has suddenly mobilized overnight, marching directly toward our southern territories with absolute, murderous intent." Matthew's deceitful, cowardly eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror, instantly realizing that his pathetic, fabricated story of random assassins was about to be completely exposed. He knew perfectly well that the terrifying Alpha of the North would never mobilize his legendary, unstoppable forces for anything less than a complete, apocalyptic war of vengeance. My father dropped the heavy, gold-filled ledger onto his pristine desk, a sudden, terrifying realization dawning in his sharp, experienced eyes as he stared directly at my trembling fiancé. The civilized, polite men of the South were finally about to learn the devastating, brutally bloody consequences of allowing the Alpha's chosen mate to be harmed. The opulent, dangerously quiet atmosphere of Lord Harrington's grand study was completely shattered by the terrifying news of the advancing Northern Army. Matthew took a sudden, violently panicked step backward, his polished leather boots slipping slightly on the perfectly smooth, imported marble floor. The cowardly merchant desperately tried to maintain his highly fabricated facade of innocent bravery, but his violently trembling hands gave his deception away completely. Lord Harrington slowly stood up from behind his massive, incredibly expensive oak desk, his sharp, highly experienced eyes narrowing intensely at the young man standing before him. For the very first time since the devastating, heartbreaking kidnapping of his only daughter, the grieving father truly looked at the pristine condition of Matthew's clothes. "If you fought 50 heavily armed, ruthless assassins in the muddy forest," Lord Harrington asked with a deadly, terrifyingly icy calmness, "why is there absolutely no dirt or blood on your expensive wedding suit?" Matthew opened his deceitful, cowardly mouth to stammer out another pathetic, poorly constructed excuse, but a sudden noise completely cut off his desperate words. A massive, deeply terrifying blast from a heavy northern war horn echoed violently through the southern city, rattling the stained glass windows of the wealthy estate. "The Alpha's vanguard has already reached our northern gates," the terrified guard captain shouted from the hallway, his rough voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. Lord Harrington completely ignored his cowardly future son-in-law, rushing immediately out onto the grand stone balcony that directly overlooked the bustling, crowded city square. Down below, a solitary, heavily armored rider on a massive, terrifyingly muscular black warhorse had violently breached the outer courtyard of the southern capital. The fearsome northern warrior did not immediately draw a steel weapon, but he carried a heavy, blood-soaked burlap sack tied securely to his dark leather saddle. With a fluid, incredibly powerful motion, the dark rider tossed the heavy sack directly onto the pristine white cobblestones of the wealthy merchant district. The grisly package landed with a sickening, heavy thud, spilling the broken, distinctly marked weapons of Silas's notorious mercenary gang out for everyone to clearly see. Hear the absolute, undeniable truth from the undisputed king of the north, the heavily armored herald roared, his booming voice easily carrying over the terrified gasps of the southern citizens. Your cowardly, pathetic merchant boy did not fight a single enemy to protect his beautiful bride today. Matthew cowardly hid behind the cathedral curtains to save his own miserable skin, completely abandoning Lady Victoria to a ruthless gang of filthy, violent kidnappers. The great Alpha Dominic rode into the deadly Shadow Ridge forest completely alone, mercilessly annihilating the vile mercenaries who dared to touch his chosen mate. The shocking, undeniable truth hit the crowded city square like a massive, devastating physical blow, completely destroying Matthew's carefully crafted reputation in a matter of mere seconds. The wealthy merchants and noble ladies who had pitied the young man only moments ago now stared at the balcony with expressions of sheer, unadulterated disgust. Lord Harrington turned slowly away from the stone balcony, his aging, fiercely proud face twisted into a terrifying mask of absolute, murderous fury. Matthew had already fallen heavily to his pathetic knees on the rich carpet, weeping uncontrollably and begging desperately for mercy from the enraged, heartbroken father. Lock this deceitful, cowardly rat in the deepest, darkest dungeon we possess, Lord Harrington commanded his royal guards, his booming voice shaking with pure, righteous anger. He will face the absolute, unforgiving justice of the Northern King when the fearsome Alpha finally arrives to return my precious, beloved daughter. As the heavily armored guards violently dragged the screaming, deeply pathetic merchant away by his collar, the massive silver gates of the city slowly began to open wide. Just a few miles outside the highly fortified southern walls, our luxurious, softly sprung carriage rolled smoothly along the wide, well-paved King's Highway. I sat extremely close beside Dominic on the plush velvet bench, my tired head resting comfortably against the solid, incredibly warm muscle of his broad shoulder. The terrifying, deafening blast of his vanguard's war horn had easily reached my delicate ears in the quiet countryside, signaling the absolute end of my former, highly restrictive life. Your father knows the absolute truth now, my sweet, brave girl, Dominic murmured softly, gently running his large, calloused fingers through my cleanly brushed hair. The pathetic, cowardly boy who abandoned you to the wolves will never be allowed to show his deceitful face in polite society ever again. I looked up into his fiercely glowing, golden eyes, feeling an overwhelming, profoundly deep sense of gratitude for the terrifyingly protective monster who had saved my ruined soul. I do not care what happens to him or his false reputation anymore, I replied honestly, my soft voice filled with a newfound, incredibly quiet but undeniable strength. Matthew belongs entirely to the disappointing past, and my beautiful, thrilling future is sitting right beside me in this heavily guarded carriage. Dominic smiled warmly down at me, a stunning, breathtakingly handsome expression that completely transformed his normally harsh, terrifying features into pure, devoted love. We are not entering your father's city as a tragically rescued victim and her terrifying, barbaric northern conqueror, the powerful Alpha promised smoothly, his deep voice vibrating with absolute authority. We are riding through those massive silver gates as an unbreakable, eternal partnership of equals, bound by a soul-deep connection that absolutely no one can ever sever. He gently lifted my chin with his strong, warm index finger, ensuring that my eyes were completely locked onto his fierce, unwavering gaze. They will all bow deeply in absolute, unquestioning respect to my beautiful, fiercely resilient queen, or I will personally bring their precious city to its knees. I tightened my gentle grip on his massive, heavily scarred hand, my fragile heart suddenly swelling with a fierce, burning love that completely erased every single remaining trace of my former, foolish fears. The highly civilized, deeply judgmental southern capital was about to witness the glorious, triumphant return of a fiercely protected bride. I was no longer the frightened, submissive lamb who had desperately sought the false safety of a weak, cowardly man's shadow. I was being escorted directly home by the most dangerous, unconditionally devoted man in the entire world, and I had never felt more incredibly powerful in my entire life. The massive silver gates of the southern capital groaned loudly as they were slowly pulled open by a dozen terrified city guards. A profound, suffocating silence instantly fell over the crowded streets as our heavily armored northern escort finally rode into the grand city square. The wealthy nobles who had gathered to gossip about my tragic, humiliating kidnapping now stood frozen in absolute, undeniable fear. They stared with wide, terrified eyes at the breathtaking display of raw, unapologetic military power marching directly through their pristine streets. Our luxurious, softly sprung carriage rolled smoothly to a complete stop right in front of the sweeping marble steps of my father's ancestral estate. The fearsome northern warriors immediately formed a highly disciplined, impenetrable steel wall around our carriage to keep the curious crowds at a perfectly safe distance. Dominic did not wait for my father's nervous footman to rush forward and open the heavy wooden carriage door for us. The towering alpha pushed the polished door open himself, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun with the effortless, terrifying grace of a lethal predator. A collective gasp of sheer terror rippled through the gathered crowd as the legendary, undefeated King of the North finally revealed his handsome, hardened face. He looked completely terrifying in his dark combat armor, radiating a dominant, overwhelming aura that made the southern aristocrats genuinely want to drop to their knees. But Dominic completely ignored the terrified gasps of the wealthy onlookers, turning his exceptionally broad back to the entire city with complete, arrogant dismissal. He reached his massive, heavily gauntleted hands back inside the warm carriage, waiting patiently and quietly for me to take hold of him. I placed my small, delicate hands securely into his waiting palms, feeling a sudden, massive surge of profound confidence course through my entire trembling body. The terrifying warlord gently lifted me completely out of the carriage, setting my feet softly onto the white cobblestones as if I were a precious, incredibly fragile jewel. I certainly did not look like the broken, deeply traumatized victim they all expected to see returning from the deadly, unforgiving Shadow Ridge forest. Instead of a ruined, bloody wedding dress, I was proudly wearing the magnificent, snow-white fur of the northern sovereign draped elegantly over my shoulders. I stood incredibly tall beside the most dangerous man in the realm, completely unbothered by the hundreds of shocked, judgmental eyes staring directly at us. Victoria, my father's heartbroken, wildly trembling voice suddenly cried out, completely breaking the heavy, terrifying silence of the grand square. Lord Harrington practically shoved his way past his own heavily armed elite guards, his aging, deeply lined face absolutely covered in desperate, joyful tears. I let go of Dominic's warm hand for just a single, brief moment, running quickly forward to wrap my arms tightly around my weeping father's trembling shoulders. My father sobbed uncontrollably into my messy hair, his massive, overwhelming relief pouring out of him as he finally realized his only daughter was completely safe and unharmed. He pulled back slightly, his sharp, highly experienced eyes frantically scanning my pale face for any hidden signs of cruel trauma or lingering physical pain. Instead of finding lingering terror, he only found a quiet, deeply unshakable strength shining brightly in my clear, unwavering eyes. Lord Harrington slowly turned his focused attention to the towering, heavily armored Alpha standing patiently behind me like an impenetrable wall of dark steel. The wealthy merchant lord braced his aging shoulders, bravely preparing to aggressively negotiate with the dangerous warlord for my safe, unconditional release back into his custody. But before my father could speak a single, defensive word to protect me, Dominic did something that absolutely shocked the entire civilized southern capital to its core. The terrifying, Ruthless king of the north placed his right fist firmly over his armored heart and bowed his dark head deeply in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. Lord Harrington, Dominic spoke incredibly clearly, his deep, rumbling voice echoing powerfully off the surrounding marble buildings and towering statues. I am deeply honored to safely return your beautiful, fiercely resilient daughter to the warmth and safety of her rightful home. My father stared at the bowing warlord in absolute, stunned silence, completely unprepared for such a highly civilized, deeply respectful greeting from a supposed northern barbarian. Dominic slowly raised his handsome, heavily scarred face, his glowing, intensely golden eyes locking directly onto my father's bewildered, cautious expression. But I have absolutely no intention of leaving this city without her by my side, the Alpha continued smoothly, his velvety voice filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. I have come to formally beg for Lady Victoria's hand in marriage today, and I am fully prepared to offer my entire, vast northern kingdom as her rightful dowry. A deafening wave of shocked, frantic whispers instantly exploded across the crowded city square, the wealthy nobles completely unable to process the Alpha's incredibly generous, unprecedented offer. No reigning king in recorded human history had ever offered his entire, sovereign territory as a financial dowry for a simple, untitled merchant's daughter. My father looked frantically between my calm, confident face and the Alpha's fiercely devoted golden eyes, finally understanding the profound, permanent shift in my destiny. You are not simply taking her away from me by force? Lord Harrington asked softly, his aging voice trembling heavily with a mixture of overwhelming relief and deep, lingering confusion. Dominic easily closed the brief physical distance between us, gently wrapping his massive, incredibly warm arm securely around my slender waist in a highly public display of absolute possession. I would never force her beautiful, gentle soul to do anything against her own free will, Dominic declared loudly, making absolutely sure every single person in the crowded square heard his unbreakable vow. She is the undisputed, absolute ruler of my deeply scarred heart, and if she commands me to leave this city empty-handed right now, I will turn my army around this very second. The entire southern capital instantly held its collective breath, waiting in terrifying, agonizing anticipation for my final, world-altering decision to be spoken aloud. I looked up into the incredibly handsome, deeply devoted face of the man who had mercilessly slaughtered an entire camp of violent men just to keep me safe from harm. I thought very briefly about the weak, deceitful coward currently locked in the dark dungeon below us, and the false, incredibly fragile safety I had once desperately tried to cling to. Then, I turned back around to face my loving, protective father and the massive, silently watching crowd of highly judgmental southern aristocrats. He is absolutely not leaving this city without me, father, I announced incredibly clearly, my steady voice carrying easily through the absolute, shocked silence of the Grand Plaza. Because I have finally realized, through the most painful lesson imaginable, that my true home is not found hidden safely inside these restrictive silver walls. I leaned my tired head proudly against Dominic's heavily armored chest, completely and joyfully embracing the wild, beautiful destiny I had once been so terribly afraid of accepting. My home, my safety, and my heart belong entirely with him. The sun dipped slightly behind the towering cathedral spires, casting a long, highly dramatic shadow over the quiet, completely spellbound crowd of onlookers. Even the gentle southern winds seemed to pause for a moment, as if the very elements of nature were acknowledging the undeniable birth of a new, incredibly powerful alliance. My father's tense shoulders finally relaxed, completely dropping the heavy, invisible burden of profound worry he had been carrying since the devastating moment of my brutal abduction. He reached out slowly and gently placed his wrinkled, warm hand over my small fingers, offering his silent, loving blessing to the highly unconventional path I had firmly chosen. The elite northern guards standing fiercely around us simultaneously slammed the heavy wooden butts of their steel spears against the white cobblestones in a unified, deafening show of ultimate respect. The rhythmic, incredibly thunderous sound echoed like a massive, living heartbeat through the center of the city, permanently sealing my newly accepted fate as their future queen. Dominic smiled beautifully down at me, a genuinely breathtaking, rare expression that finally promised me a long lifetime of thrilling, intensely protected, and beautifully unapologetic devotion. The grand, highly emotional celebration of our unexpected betrothal quickly transitioned into a necessary, somber task that I had to personally complete. Before I could fully embrace my breathtaking future in the frozen north, I needed to permanently sever the final, pathetic chain linking me to my traumatic past. I gently asked Dominic to escort me down into the damp, entirely lightless dungeons located deep beneath my father's beautiful, sprawling estate. The fiercely protective alpha did not question my difficult decision for a single second, completely understanding my deep psychological need for absolute, undeniable closure. He simply intertwined his massive, incredibly warm fingers with my delicate ones and silently guided me down the winding, torchlit stone staircase. The air grew increasingly heavy and freezing cold as we descended, providing a stark, deeply depressing contrast to the bright, sunlit plaza we had just left behind. My luxurious, snow-white fur cloak dragged softly across the dirty stone floor, acting as a glaring, undeniable symbol of my newly acquired royal status in this miserable place. We finally reached the deepest, darkest cell in the underground prison, where heavy iron bars securely trapped the deceitful man who had so cowardly abandoned me. The cold, unforgiving iron bars of the miserable cell stood as a permanent, undeniable barrier between my newly discovered freedom and his eternal, self-inflicted captivity. Matthew was huddled pathetically in the darkest corner of the freezing cell, his once pristine wedding suit completely ruined by damp moss and filthy, foul-smelling mud. When the terrified, disgraced merchant heard our approaching footsteps, he scrambled desperately toward the iron bars with wild, bloodshot, and highly panicked eyes. He reached his shaking, filthy hands through the cold metal grating, weeping uncontrollably as he fell heavily to his weak knees on the unforgiving stone floor. "Victoria, my sweet, forgiving Victoria, please tell them to release me from this terrifying, unjust nightmare," Matthew begged, his rough voice cracking with pure, selfish desperation. "You know perfectly well that I only ran away because I wanted to find the armed city guards to properly rescue you from those violent, terrifying monsters." I stood perfectly still just inches away from his grasping hands, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, icy pity for the incredibly pathetic, broken creature kneeling before me. I watched his desperate, trembling fingers frantically grasp at the empty, freezing air, finally realizing that the man I had once planned to marry was nothing more than a hollow, empty shell. Dominic remained standing quietly in the flickering shadows right behind my shoulder, acting as a massive, silent guardian who allowed me the absolute freedom to fight my own emotional battles. The terrifying Northern King did not need to issue a single spoken threat, because his overwhelming, highly lethal presence alone made Matthew violently flinch in sheer terror. "You did not run away to find the guards, Matthew, and we both know the absolute, undeniable truth of your disgusting cowardice," I replied with a completely calm, beautifully steady voice. "You deliberately hid behind a heavy velvet curtain while a brutal mercenary held a sharp steel blade directly against my extremely fragile throat." Matthew sobbed even louder, desperately trying to conjure the old, charming smile that had once successfully tricked my foolish, highly sheltered young heart. "I was completely unarmed and terrified, Victoria, but I still deeply, truly love you with all of my heart," he lied smoothly, still frantically attempting to manipulate my hardened emotions. I slowly shook my head, feeling an overwhelming, incredibly beautiful sense of profound freedom wash completely over my rapidly healing soul. "You do not know the very first thing about true, sacrificial, and unconditional love, Matthew," I told him softly, glancing back fondly at the magnificent, heavily scarred warlord behind me. "True love is absolutely not hiding in the comfortable, safe shadows when the terrifying, deadly storm finally breaks over your vulnerable head. True love is willingly riding straight into the very heart of the deadly darkness, fully prepared to completely destroy the entire world just to protect the one you claim to cherish. I turned my focused, unwavering attention back to the weeping, pathetic merchant, my clear eyes completely devoid of any lingering affection or foolish, unearned mercy. You are completely dead to me now, Matthew, and you will spend the rest of your miserable, cowardly life rotting away in this lightless, forgotten cage. My father has officially stripped you of your wealthy merchant title, and your highly respected family has publicly disowned you out of sheer, undeniable public shame. Matthew wailed loudly in absolute, horrifying despair, finally realizing that his famously silver tongue could no longer save him from the devastating consequences of his own selfish actions. I did not stay a single second longer in that terrible place to listen to his pathetic, agonizing cries for an impossible, unearned forgiveness. I simply turned my back on the broken, deceitful man and walked gracefully back toward the incredibly strong, eagerly waiting arms of my fiercely devoted northern king. Dominic gently wrapped his heavy, dark winter cloak completely around my slender shoulders, securely shielding me from the damp, freezing chill of the underground prison. The deeply comforting, heavy scent of wild pine and dark, rolling thunder instantly enveloped my senses, completely washing away the foul, miserable stench of the southern dungeon. Are you completely finished with this pathetic, worthless southern trash, my beautiful queen? The Alpha asked softly, his glowing golden eyes shining with a fierce, immensely proud warmth. I am entirely finished with him, and I am completely finished with this restrictive, highly judgmental city, I answered honestly, offering my handsome savior a genuinely radiant, breathtaking smile. Take me home, Dominic, to the wild, beautifully untamed northern mountains where my soul truly belongs. The powerful warlord effortlessly scooped me up into his incredibly strong arms, carrying me easily up the winding stone stairs away from the suffocating darkness forever. By the time we finally emerged back into the warm, golden afternoon sunlight of the main courtyard, his massive, highly disciplined army was already perfectly prepared for the long journey north. My loving father stood quietly by our luxurious carriage, holding a beautifully crafted wooden chest containing my deceased mother's most precious, ancient family jewelry. We shared a final, incredibly emotional, and deeply loving embrace, his aging tears mixing freely with my own joyful ones as he tenderly kissed my forehead one last time. Lord Harrington knew perfectly well that he was not losing his only daughter today, but rather watching her finally step confidently into the magnificent, powerful destiny she was born to fulfill. Dominic carefully lifted me back into the comfortable, velvet-lined carriage, securing a heavy, incredibly warm fur blanket gently across my resting lap. The fierce Alpha mounted his terrifying, massive black warhorse right beside my open window, raising his heavy steel broadsword high into the clear, bright southern sky. A deafening, incredibly thunderous roar erupted from the 50 elite northern warriors, a glorious, terrifying sound that officially signaled our triumphant, highly anticipated departure. As the heavy carriage slowly began to roll forward, I looked out the small glass window at the rapidly shrinking silver gates of my former childhood home. The rhythmic, incredibly soothing sound of the massive carriage wheels turning against the cobblestones felt exactly like the beautiful, steady ticking of a brand new clock starting my true life. Every single northern soldier marching perfectly in sync beside us served as a lethal, deeply loyal reminder that I would never, ever be left entirely unprotected again. I felt absolutely no fear, no lingering regret, and no hidden sadness for the quiet, predictable, and highly sheltered life I was leaving entirely behind me. I was riding directly toward a world of wild, unapologetic passion, fiercely and eternally guarded by a magnificent beast who loved me infinitely more than life itself. The long, grueling journey across the vast continent finally brought us to the breathtaking, incredibly dramatic edge of the known world. The soft, rolling green hills of the civilized south slowly gave way to the magnificent, towering peaks of the frozen northern mountains. I looked out the carriage window, completely mesmerized by the sheer, unapologetic beauty of Dominic's untamed, fiercely ancient homeland. The southern nobles had always arrogantly described the north as a desolate, barbaric wasteland completely devoid of any true culture or warmth. But as our massive iron gates swung open to reveal the legendary winter fortress, I immediately realized they were completely, foolishly wrong. The grand capital city was a breathtaking architectural masterpiece of towering white marble and dark, gleaming obsidian carved directly into the mountainside. Massive, roaring fire pits lined the wide, perfectly paved stone streets, casting a beautiful, intensely golden glow against the falling white snow. Thousands of hardened northern citizens had gathered in the massive central plaza, braving the bitter winter cold just to catch a glimpse of their fierce alpha. They did not look upon me with the cruel, highly judgmental sneers I was so accustomed to seeing in my father's wealthy southern court. Instead, I saw genuine, overwhelming awe and deep, unconditional respect shining brightly in their clear, beautiful weather-beaten eyes. Dominic gently halted his massive black warhorse and gracefully dismounted, his heavy dark leather boots crunching softly against the fresh snow. He walked toward my velvet-lined carriage with the terrifying, deeply beautiful confidence of a man who absolutely owned the entire world and everything in it. When he opened the heavy wooden door, he did not just offer me his calloused hand to simply help me step down into the freezing winter air. The towering alpha lifted me effortlessly into his incredibly strong arms, carrying me proudly up the grand, sweeping steps of his ancient, magnificent castle. A sudden, deafening roar of absolute joy and fierce, undeniable loyalty erupted from the massive crowd, echoing powerfully across the frozen mountain peaks. They were fiercely celebrating the safe, highly triumphant arrival of the brave woman who had finally managed to capture their terrifying ruler's deeply guarded heart. Dominic gently set me down on my feet at the very top of the grand marble stairs, keeping his incredibly warm, fiercely protective arm wrapped securely around my slender waist. He slowly turned to face his incredibly loyal people, his glowing golden eyes sweeping proudly over the vast, wildly cheering sea of northern warriors. The fearsome warlord raised his heavily scarred hand, instantly commanding a profound, completely breathless silence to fall over the entire magnificent city. My beautiful, resilient people, I have returned to you today not just as your undefeated king, but as a completely and willingly conquered man, Dominic announced smoothly. His deep, velvety voice vibrated with a raw, overwhelming emotion that instantly brought hot, joyful tears directly to my freezing eyes. I proudly present to you the absolute ruler of my soul, the fiercely brave woman who will stand firmly by my side until the very end of time. He slowly turned back to me, reaching into the heavy leather pouch at his wide belt to retrieve a stunning, incredibly precious ancient artifact. It was not a heavy, restrictive crown made of cold southern gold or suffocating, expensive diamonds meant to purely display shallow financial wealth. It was a breathtakingly delicate necklace made of pure, perfectly polished silver, holding a single, magnificent white wolf fang securely at its center. Dominic gently fastened the beautiful necklace around my delicate neck, the cool silver resting perfectly against my rapidly beating, intensely joyful heart. This is the ancient, unbreakable vow of the Northern King, my sweet Victoria, he whispered softly, his incredibly handsome face leaning dangerously close to mine. You are my heart, my fiercely protected mate, and the absolutely only queen this vast, untamed empire will ever formally acknowledge. I reached up and gently rested my trembling hands against his strong, incredibly broad chest, feeling the deeply steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the dark armor. The freezing winter wind whipped wildly around us, tangling my long, dark hair deeply into his luxurious, thick snow-white fur cloak. But I felt absolutely no cold, no lingering fear, and absolutely no painful hesitation about the magnificent, wildly unpredictable future stretching out before us. I had finally found my true, eternal sanctuary in the immensely powerful, fiercely devoted arms of the incredibly dangerous monster I had once foolishly feared. I pulled his handsome, heavily scarred face down toward mine, softly pressing my lips against his in a deep, breathtakingly passionate kiss of absolute, unconditional surrender. The entire Northern Kingdom immediately erupted into a deafening, incredibly glorious cheer that physically shook the very ancient foundations of the towering mountains. But in that perfect, beautifully suspended moment of pure magic, the cheering crowd and the violently falling snow completely faded into absolute nothingness. There was only Dominic, the terrifying, magnificent alpha who had mercilessly burned the entire world to ashes just to keep me safely in his powerful arms. And I knew, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that I would happily let the entire universe burn 1,000,000 times over just to stay right here with him forever.